While games have writing and framing and dialogue in cutscenes just like movies, they also create personalized stories through play. One of the best games at doing this is the 2002 LucasArts game Jedi Outcast, which I believe is the gold standard of Jedi games. It and the newest Star Wars game, EA's Jedi Fallen Order, have a lot of surface similarities. They are both about a former Jedi who has tried to put the Force behind them, who are pushed into circumstances where they need to get back in touch with their Jedi self, and both the written story and the mechanics focus on this. Not only do these similarities make them an interesting comparison, but because they are about two characters who become Jedi, both games are therefore about what makes someone a Jedi. Since they are games, they are also about what it's like to play as and feel like a Jedi. The way these two games tackle these questions also provide a look at how games, game stories, and Star Wars have all evolved in the 20 years between them. I loved the Star Wars games of my youth, but it has been a long time since there has been a Star Wars game I liked. About halfway through Fallen Order, I was sure I had my final opinion. It was pretty good, but nothing special. The last quarter of the game completely changed my opinion, and I want to look at how it managed to do that. First, I want to be a little more explicit about how game mechanics work with a story, because a lot of the time when people talk about a game's story, they're separating it from the gameplay to talk about just the part that a writer wrote. They treat it as though you have this one part of the game where you are being told a story that was written and plotted, has character beats and arcs, etc., and there's this other part of the game where you are pressing buttons and overcoming obstacles. But they aren't really that separate. Let me give you an example.
This is my last day on this ship.
Oh yeah? Where you moving?
Sector 7 had an opening, so I applied.
Not bad. Should be a quiet last day.
Get him!
This is a joke, and a joke is a story. Part of this story was written by a writer, part of it was designed by a game designer, and part of it was executed and personalized by me. These are the three elements that make up a video game story. The writer creates a narrative context for play, the game designer creates mechanics for play, and I as the player weave the two together in my own unique way. I understand why people separate these things because it makes it easier to analyze and critique each part of the game, and I'm going to do the same thing. But this kind of analysis can make it seem like the story and the gameplay are more separate than they actually are. We're going to look at how these games make you feel like a Jedi through play first, but remember that if the game is doing a good job, this feeling should fit into the Jedi story the game is telling. Jedi Outcast is heavily influenced by id Software games like Quake and Doom and plays almost the same way. It even uses the id engine. Really, like the earlier entries in its series, it's still just a Doom clone, and the first few levels where you don't have a lightsaber yet make that really obvious. What turns it into something special is how hard the game tries to answer the question, what would it feel like to fight like a Jedi? The first way they do this is by making you be and play as not a Jedi, just a regular mercenary. Even once you get your lightsaber and your first weak force powers, the game will immediately start throwing enemies at you that can't be beaten with Jedi powers to make sure you still use your other tools. Slowly, the game gives you a wider variety of Jedi tools to use and ups their power as you go on, which helps you feel like a resourceful Jedi getting more powerful all the time until by the final levels you are mowing down enemies with ease that once gave you trouble, while at the same time throwing you new challenges. It's a great feeling. Also, the saber combat is just insanely satisfying and fun in this game. But the gameplay has very little to say about the Jedi morality of how you fight. One of my favorite tools for dealing with faraway enemies in the later portions of the game is to force choke them into the air and then slam them into the ground. This feels awesome, but it doesn't really feel very Jedi-like. In fact, I'm not sure that mowing down hundreds or thousands of enemies is particularly Jedi-like, but these are video games and so we'll just gloss over that. So how does all this Jedi stuff play into the story? Fallen Order will have a lot to say about the dark and light sides of the Force, and generally a lot to say in its story overall, even if some of it doesn't really make sense. The story in Outcast exists primarily as a functional frame for a good Jedi adventure game. It gives the play just enough context to make it engaging without really pulling the focus towards the plot. Still, it manages to tell an excellent story faithful to the Jedi spirit of the original trilogy. We begin with ex-Jedi Kyle Katarn and his partner Jan Ors being sent on a mercenary mission for the New Republic sometime after the end of the original trilogy. Then a Dark Jedi and his apprentice show up. Desan, the Dark Jedi, grabs Jan and smacks Kyle around a bit before giving the order to execute her. Kyle, now consumed with revenge, goes to the Valley of the Jedi, a place from the previous game. Anyway, he uses it to pump up his Force mojo, and then goes to get his lightsaber from Luke. These scenes are where we get our first discussions about anger and revenge. Outcast's story is built on a standard revenge tragedy. Revenge tragedies go all the way back to Seneca's plays in the 1st century, and they generally follow a simple outline. There's an atrocity, our hero constructs themselves as a revenger, and then they commit a retributive atrocity. This type of story is often used in modern media as a minimal story to justify cool action. In John Wick, the atrocity and construction only take a few minutes of screen time, and then we get to spend almost the entire movie committing our retributive atrocity, and it's very fun. Outcast also uses it as a minimal story, but the writer understands that a straight revenge story driven by anger is not compatible with a Jedi story, so they complicate it right from the start. Kyle's father and Luke both ask Kyle to give up his anger, and they call him out for seeking revenge, though neither tries to stop him. They also say,
"May the Force be with you."
It hasn't been so far.
A small but very effective way the writer communicates Kyle's character arc is in his response to this.
May the Force be with you. Right.
He starts here with rejection and cynicism, which is how he currently views the Force, a means to his revenge and nothing more. Kyle's anger continues to ferment, and eventually he catches up with Tavion, Desan's apprentice. Tavion taunts Kyle about his quest for revenge.
Have you come seeking vengeance? Oh, that's not very Jedi-like.
And after a brutal fight, Kyle prepares to strike her down in anger as she begs for mercy.
The kind of mercy you showed Jan?
But wait.
She lives! I can tell you where she is!
Liar!
She could be lying. Kyle doesn't trust Tavion here at all. He makes that explicit afterwards.
Jan may be there.
Jan's alive?
Maybe. I don't know.
But this sudden reemergence of a small hope, combined with her pitiable groveling, awakens in our Revenger feelings of mercy, and he spares her life. Kyle has been hurtling down the road to revenge, driven by his anger, which in Star Wars usually means falling to the dark side. But at the crucial moment, helped by Tavion's confession and groveling, Kyle finally sees the danger of the road he's going down, and his arc takes a 90-degree turn. From here, Kyle begins letting go of his anger and begins going down the road towards being a Jedi.
May the Force be with you, Kyle.
We'll see. Something's changed in you. You seem less angry. Maybe. There's a chance Jan may still be alive on the Doomgiver. Sometimes even a small hope is enough to defeat the dark side, Kyle. May the Force be with you, Kyle. Yeah, you too, Luke.
She must have whimpered your name on at least 17 different occasions over the last few days.
Is that supposed to make me angry? I'm past that, Gallic.
Until by the end of the game, Kyle is the one offering Desan redemption and telling Luke,
And may the Force be with you, Luke.
Mostly, this story exists to justify the action, and it does not take up that much time. The game works really hard to keep the focus on the Star Wars-y action, environments, and set pieces, and mostly lets the story take the background. Still, the writer managed to take a revenge story and turn it into a story compatible with a Jedi, making it about a near fall to the dark side and an eventual embrace of being a Jedi by the end. And while Kyle is growing as a Jedi, the player is growing as a Jedi right alongside him as they unlock more Force powers and get more comfortable with the mechanics. Yeah, there are some callbacks and references that I'm not a huge fan of.
All right, say goodbye to this wretched hive of scum and villainy.
Because these things make me feel like the writer is imposing dialogue on the character instead of the character speaking naturally. But overall, this story works really well. Part of the reason it works, though, is because Kyle is really charismatic and funny.
You look like nothing more than a bantha herder.
Well, you look like an overgrown Kowakian monkey lizard, so I guess looks don't count for much. Hand her over.
Wisecracking protagonist is somewhat of a cliche, but it still works here. Honestly, all of the characters in this game are really well written and serve their purposes effectively.
I, Galak Fayar the First, the genius who conceived of the Shadow Armor, will rule the galaxy with a Cortosis fist. Worlds will tremble, stars will shudder.
Your shields will fall.
This is a great Jedi game with a great Jedi story. Lastly, I want to note that, though I didn't talk about it much here, the rest of the story that has to do with the Valley and Desan and Fayar's machinations also makes sense and work fairly well with Kyle's arc. It's not incredible or anything, but there are some fun twists, the stakes are there, it's well plotted, and the breadcrumbs he follows to Tavion and then Desan are fun to follow and make sense while tying everything together. Jedi Outcast had a sequel, Jedi Academy, which was still pretty fun, but the story, characters, and writing were a massive step down. Then we didn't get another lightsaber game for almost 20 years, until... While Jedi Outcast was trying to answer the question of what would it be like to fight as a Jedi, Fallen Order is answering a different question. Can EA make a decent single-player Star Wars game? Their answer to this question was to take a bunch of mechanics from other successful modern games, jam them into a Star Wars shell, and hire some decent writers to try and make it all work. And overall, it did work. Though it was close. I wouldn't blame anyone for bailing on this game halfway through, and we'll get to that. But first, we need to talk about the mechanics, which means we need to talk about Dark Souls. Fallen Order is basically a mashup of 3 different tried and true genres. The combat mechanics are lifted from FromSoft games like Dark Souls and Sekiro, the traversal mechanics and storytelling style from action-adventure games like Uncharted and Tomb Raider, and the level design from games like Metroid and Castlevania, where you can backtrack to unlock more paths in old areas once you unlock new power-ups. It's an interesting mix, and it works pretty well. The idea is that Cal, our protagonist, is getting back in touch with the Force, and so he gets access to more and more areas as his Force arsenal grows. The Dark Souls combat, well, really it's more like Sekiro than Dark Souls, but that's a minor difference. Anyway, it feels pretty good. Dodging, deflecting, parrying, finding openings, using Force powers, they all fit pretty neatly into the FromSoft combat. But that's all they do. In Dark Souls, the punishing combat is part of the story. The story of Dark Souls is about failure and persistence. The game expects you to die over and over again, and that's part of the story. The Hollows are, in a meta sense, all the other players who succumb to the belief that they won't be able to beat the game. The story requires other players to fail, and it heavily encourages cooperation and communication to succeed. The actual narrative of the game hinges on how the bonfires, which are the only save points in the game, are going out. In Fallen Order, all of these mechanics are just there because they worked in Dark Souls and people like Dark Souls, so let's see if they work in Star Wars. And they do. The mechanics are pretty functional, even though the meaning is stripped away. These meditation points have no internal consistency, and the game doesn't place as much emphasis on challenge and failure, but it still feels pretty good to play. Parrying, executes Force powers, they all feel really good. The exploration doesn't feel quite as good because you mostly unlock cosmetics instead of items you can use in a gameplay sense, though you also unlock health, force, and stim upgrades as well as little stories which give XP. Cal has a special Force power called Sense Exposition, where he touches an object and learns or sees something about it. Super handy video game narrative tool that helps tell little stories the same way finding items does in Dark Souls. I think the writer tells us a little too much sometimes. Cal often tells us the meaning of what we found instead of just telling us what it is, and figuring out what it means is half the fun, for me at least. In Dark Souls there is, strictly speaking, only one difficulty setting. This goes a long way to making the players who beat the game feel awesome, but there is still some level of choosing your difficulty through your build. An archer, wizard, sword and board, and two-hander plus roll are all going to experience a different level of challenge. In Fallen Order, everyone plays as a Jedi. Yeah, you can slightly alter the experience by putting more points in saber moves, force moves, or defense, but the basic mechanics are the same for everyone, so it's probably right to have difficulty settings. My issue is that the difficulty curve felt really weird. For this video, I played both of these games on the hardest difficulty. Frankly, Jedi Outcast is pretty challenging on every setting, and though it is massively easier on lower settings, I still remember it being a serious challenge to beat the game as a kid, and that I still needed to have some mastery of the game. The hardest difficulty is brutally challenging. Enemies will punish the slightest mistake, and you have very little health on top of the existing challenge. I am not some god of video games, so on the hardest setting, I happily spammed the quick save button throughout the whole game to preserve every advantage I managed to eke out. Despite that, the difficulty curve feels very fluid. If you aren't strafing, using your right-hand cover advantage, or being creative with your other tools at the start of the game, you are going to get smacked around. But once you get a saber, these enemies become completely trivial to deal with. You get one room to feel like a god where you can block every blaster bolt sent your way and slice up all the bad guys. Even in this room though, you have to watch out for enemies who now have the grenades you had access to, but you can push those back with the force. Walk up this ramp and suddenly you are faced with an unblockable sniper rifle to ram home that just because you have a lightsaber doesn't mean this game is getting any easier, and to remember to use your other weapons too, because your lightsaber isn't the best answer for every problem. Once you get the hang of these enemies, it's time to fight Dark Jedi, then it's time for Elite Stormtroopers, then Tavion, then Dark Jedi whose armor resists your lightsaber, and then finally it's time to fight Disan. Good luck. This is what a good difficulty curve looks like. Fallen Order is nowhere near as challenging, but it does have a more punishing save system imported from Dark Souls. This save system works well because it makes everyone have to accomplish the exact same challenge every time they die. They have to make it from the bonfire to the next one, whether that's through an area, a boss, or both. It removes the incentive for weird quick save spamming, which can kind of feel like cheating at times. It removes the bad feeling you get when you die after not saving, which makes the mistake feel like forgetting to save rather than because you made a mistake in gameplay. But Fallen Order isn't as hard as Dark Souls or Sekiro. Now, that's okay. Not every game is going for that same level of hardcore difficulty. It is a little weird for so many of the Dark Souls mechanics to be in the game without the difficulty, but the game is still a decent challenge for most of it. The game does give you more and more of a challenge as you go on, which scales well with your increasing skill and comfort with the mechanics as well as your character advancement. The problem is there's one perk that completely breaks the game once you get it. Stims refreshing the force meter. Your force powers are very powerful. They range from one-shot executes to free hits on harder enemies. A lot of the time, they just let you ignore the mechanics of the enemy if you have enough charge. It normally only charges, and even then only a little, when you block enemy attacks, attack enemies, or defeat them, so getting complete refills for healing is bonkers. Your stims don't even completely heal your own health, and force points are way more valuable than health. You don't need to heal if you can make it impossible for the enemy to hit you. Once you get this, most encounters in the game become trivial for quite a while, pretty much until you are locked into the endgame, at which point the combat becomes good again. This wouldn't be a huge deal by itself, except that this period of boring combat coincides exactly as the story reaches its peak of mediocrity. Because the story in this game is mostly mediocre. It's not bad, but until we get near the climax, it's just not very engaging. While Jedi Outcast had a highly functional, if somewhat bare-bones story with very little to say, this is a very involved story with much to say, a lot of which makes no sense. Now, before we get into spoilers, I want to reiterate that I enjoyed this game a lot. I think it's good. I even think the story is good, in the end. But the first half or so of the story really drags, and yet it still manages to finish strong. I want to try and pick it apart to try and figure out what caused the rocky start and how it still managed to stick the landing. At its core, Fallen Order is a story about trauma. Most of the game's main characters have gone through some serious stuff over the last several years, which is a really good way of telling stories during the rise of the Empire. This common theme of trauma helps tie everything together, even when the actual plot makes no sense at all. When that theme briefly begins to unravel is when we get the peak of combat and story mediocrity. You play as Cal Kestis, a former Jedi Padawan who bailed onto this planet when the clones turned on him and his master. He's been hiding a long time when suddenly his friend almost dies and he uses the Force to save him. Unfortunately, this draws the Imperial Inquisitors to him instantly, and they figure out that the Jedi is one of these handful of people. I don't know how, but it doesn't really matter. We get introduced to two new characters, the second and ninth sisters of the Inquisitors, whose trauma will also be a part of the story. Cal's friend, Prof, steps out and says some stuff about how the Empire is bad, so that the second sister can kill him and make Cal mad.
No! Look at this. A lightsaber.
We kill a bunch of stormtroopers to learn mechanics and get rescued by Cere and Grease, an ex-Jedi and her pilot sidekick, who instantly convince Cal to help them rebuild the Jedi Order. Already, we're running into a couple of issues. The story has a tendency to go very fast without using the proper writing tools and shortcuts for that kind of speed. Prof is a perfect example of this. The writer tells us that they are friends, but they don't bother to characterize that friendship, or if they do it vaguely. There are no shared jokes or quips based on history. No one gets exasperated when one of them does something in character. Prof doesn't make a dumb joke that causes Cal to sigh. When Cal takes crazy risks, Prof doesn't comment on whether that's normal or abnormal. Prof is loyal and kind, but that all makes him feel like a generic idea of a friend instead of an actual friend to Cal. There is nothing in their interactions that actually suggests they've been through hell together. And so when he dies, I just don't care, even though Cal does. This also undercuts every time in the future Cal brings him up. Thankfully, not many. One of the storytelling advantages of video games is that they have lots of time. A story that could fit into a movie gets drawn out to a length more like multiple seasons of television. This lets things sit with the audience more, the way they do with a book. Jedi Outcast has hours of hanging out with Jan before she dies, and the way she and Kyle interact make it obvious that they are good friends with a long history without anyone telling us. Now, Jan probably doesn't have that many more lines than Prof. It's just drawn out more and used better. Jedi Outcast takes its time and makes the friendship feel natural. Fallen Order makes it all happen inside 20 minutes, which is insanely fast for a video game, and still wastes that time building a friendship so generic it was barely worth that time. The problems continue when we get aboard the Mantis. Cere says some platitudes about how they want to rebuild the Jedi Order, and this is apparently enough to get Cal to drop his guard and go to sleep. She doesn't mention she was a Jedi, or say anything that ought to convince him they aren't bounty hunters. The rest of the story tracks very closely to a standard hero's journey, but instead of refusing the call here, Cal just sort of tepidly slides into the heroic role Cere has appointed for him. Refusing the call is very important, because it clarifies and reaffirms our hero's initial identity so that we can feel how much they change in accepting the call to adventure, and gives them agency when they make that choice. Instead, it feels like when Cere said rebuilding the Jedi Order, Cal's whole character changed instantly. Again, this is a game. We have so much time, and this is basic storytelling stuff. Cal ought to be protesting that he's not up for this, he's not a real Jedi, and can they please drop him on Nar Shaddaa? Cere can get him to agree to accessing the vault in repayment for them saving him without him being on the hook for more, and he can come to accept his call to adventure more naturally. Cal just accepts that he's no longer alone far, far too quickly for someone who has been alone for so long. Cere says she gets how long he's been alone, but it seems the writer didn't. But this is all pretty forgivable stuff. It makes some of these interactions feel awkward. Cere tends to say stuff out loud that might be better as subtext, and Grease will sometimes seem hilariously out of place among all the seriousness, but generally these three have a good and fun dynamic. Grease plays the role of skeptic, Cere plays the role of believer, and Cal sits somewhere in between. He's willing to try to play this heroic role, but he doesn't easily believe that he can do it, which lets you grow with him. It's a great role for a video game protagonist. Now, Cere is an ex-Jedi because of her own trauma, and her role as Cal's mentor is complicated by the fact that they are both struggling with their trauma as Jedi survivors. This has the potential for an interesting relationship, which they will instead light on fire for much of the game. Cere's old master, Eno Cordova, felt that doom was coming to the Jedi Order, so he hid a list of a bunch of Force-sensitive children so someone could train the next generation of Jedi. Because he was a researcher, he decided to hide it in this vault of a long-dead race called the Zepho here on Bogano. but in order to access it, you need a related Zepho artifact called an Astrium. Cordova says he did this because he wanted you to follow in his footsteps as he researched the Zepho. So naturally, after you chase Zepho dead-end leads over 4 different planets, he makes you go get an Astrium that he didn't even find. While I recognize this sort of sci-fi game story from KOTOR and Mass Effect, where you learn about an extinct civilization to help you conquer a contemporary threat, I find that it falls sort of flat here. Again, we're using tropes without understanding why or how they usually work. KOTOR and Mass Effect are exploratory dialogue games, so the questions that come up of how did this super advanced civilization fall have specific answers that you can discover, and these answers are relevant to the central mysteries and themes of the game, which makes discovering them highly satisfying. The mystery of the Zepho's fall barely gets answered, just some vague stuff about pride, dogma, balance, and the desire for power. Maybe you could argue that Cal and company are being prideful and thinking they can bring back the Jedi Order in the face of the Empire, but that's a bit of a stretch, and they certainly aren't being dogmatic, ignoring balance, or desiring power. It's just too vague. Hell, some of the optional exploration sections, like the crashed Venator, have more to do with Cal's story than anything relating to the Zepho. And together, all this is why I say the story is largely mediocre. Cal starts off mad about the death of a character they didn't get us to care about, and then promptly sets off to research an ancient dead civilization that will have no real relevance to the story. The only thing that's working well is the character relationships, which are generally fun, if basic and safe. But fun character dynamics will only take you so far. Eventually, you have to have conflict. Cere and Cal have the most interesting relationship as they take turns struggling with their past. Then, about halfway through the game, the second sister takes off her helmet and reveals that, surprise, she's Cere's old apprentice. Cere had said she died, but Trilla was captured after they tortured her location out of Cere and turned into an Inquisitor, also with torture. Cere clearly harbors a huge amount of guilt over this and finds it difficult to face what happened, which seems reasonable and human. What's not reasonable is that Cal seems to think she deserves that guilt, for no reason I can fathom. Yeah, you could argue she was weak, which Trilla does, but Trilla also says she chose self-interest and it clearly isn't trustworthy, because she broke under torture, and that's betrayal. Cal seems to think that's a reasonable thing he should accuse her of. I don't know about you guys, but I wouldn't accuse my friends of betrayal if someone tortured things they knew about me out of them. That seems awful. And if you are going to have your main character do stuff that seems totally awful to the player, you need to treat it like a big deal and not just gloss over it. There are reasons why Cal might feel this way. His master died to protect him, and maybe he feels like Cere should have been stronger, even done the same. Or something else I can't think of, but it needs to be clear. Later on, when the story gets good, Cal will apologize by saying,
"I'm so sorry. I was arrogant, I was foolish. I could never understand what you went through."
Sorry, but that doesn't even begin to cover it. You blamed her for something that was not her fault, that was deeply traumatic, and she was treating as her fault because of her trauma. This would be like if a soldier came home with PTSD and his wife told him she didn't trust him to protect her because he let so many of his friends die in the war. I'm not saying this is an unacceptable thing to happen in a story. It might even make for a good story, but the characters need to treat it with the gravity it deserves. Instead, it comes off like the really bad thing here was actually Cere's betrayal, and Cal eventually thinks that the betrayal was, understandable. It's bad, and it makes this section of the story almost unbearable, because it takes the part of the story that was working best and makes it the worst. And every time someone mentions Cere's betrayal, it makes the plot and themes feel weaker. And the most unfortunate part is that this coincides with the dip in combat quality. This fight with Trilla is the hardest boss fight in the game, and after you beat her and Cal accepts her explanation of Cere's betrayal, you head down into the tomb while Trilla harps on about it in your comlink. Once you get to the tomb, you unlock Force Pull, and since unlocking Force powers opens up your skill tree, this is the moment where you can get Force Refresh on stims. I'm sure all players don't get it right here, but even if you've put no points in the Force tree, it's only 5 points away, so you should be getting it soon. Look, this ability is absurdly and obviously broken, and so I'm just going to assume most people got it as soon as they could after reading it. Remember, force powers allow you to one-shot most enemies, ignore mechanics of enemies you can't one-shot, crowd control groups of enemies with no limitations, do more damage, and other absurdly powerful stuff. This one ability multiplies the usage of your force abilities by the number of stim canisters you have. You could spend 2 points over here getting like 25% more force, or you can spend 3 points over here getting somewhere between 100 and 1,000% more, scaling up to 1,000 as you find more stims. It's bonkers. From here, Cal gets captured and has to fight in some sort of criminal fighting ring because Grease gambled a bunch and got in debt, I think. It's not super clear. I think thematically this is supposed to be his weakness to go along with Cal and Cere's trauma, but it's a little vague, so it doesn't really land all that hard or mean all that much, though it does cement them as a sort of team of screw-ups. This fight is actually pretty fun and challenging, even with the stim refresh. You fight waves of monsters and then get a rematch with the guy who captured you. I think for balance reasons, if you get to the last guy and then die, they don't make you refight all the monsters, which makes it fair if you don't have the stim refresh, but too easy if you do. This is why that skill is such a problem. From here, Cal yells at Cere a bit for betraying Trilla so we can get more detached from the story. Then we go to Kashyyyk and slog through a bunch more encounters that can't be properly designed because the player can use somewhere between a handful or almost unlimited force powers in between every meditation circle. We fight the 9th sister who has the same problem, and then Cal starts to forgive Cere for betraying Trilla, which just makes him seem like even more of an asshole. This is the absolute low point of the game in every way, and if you bailed in this section, I totally understand. It's unfortunate though, because the best parts of the game are just around the corner. From here we go to Dathomir, and the combat gets a little better. Enemies with parry-based weaknesses like the Nidak get nerfed the least by having so much force, and the groups of zombies make you feel like you need as much force as you can get, though the regular Night Brothers feel like they might be a challenge if you couldn't just pull and one-shot pretty much all of them. But the best bit is that we're finally about to throw Cere's whole betrayal thing to the side and focus on better stuff. We meet this ominous-looking dude and this Night Sister, who is the last of her kind, and she tries to kill us for trespassing, which honestly is fair. And so we naturally murder the locals to try and get to the temple. We don't really get to know them much yet, but Cal's sense exposition power starts to set the stage for them. When we do get to the temple, it forces Cal to re-experience the day the clones turned on him and his master, and it is heart-wrenching.
Hey, Cal. Ready for a rematch later?
Yeah, anytime.
Sounds good. On your way to training?
Always.
All right then. I'll see you later.
Bye.
These were his friends.
There he is. Shoot to kill.
No, stop!
Then the cave gives him a vision of his master, and his master blames Cal for his death. Cal crushes his lightsaber in the vision, and then it suddenly ends, leaving his saber cracked and useless in his hands. Cal faced his fears and couldn't overcome them. He feels like he failed his master and failed as a Jedi. Then we walk outside and talk to Ominous Dude, who is a former Jedi named Taron Malicos. Malicos crash-landed on this planet after his troops turned on him during the war, much like Cal, but he could not resist the pull of the dark side on Dathomir. To a certain extent, he's a victim of circumstance, and had Cal landed here, he might have suffered the same fate, which makes Malicos a good foil. Malicos offers power over and knowledge of many such temples as these when Marin, the Night Sister from earlier, shows up to point out that she now realizes Malicos was lying to her and unleashes her zombies, forcing us to run since we are defenseless without our lightsaber. Back on the ship, Cal sinks to the floor, thinking he's failed. All his worst fears about himself have been confirmed. Cere tells Cal her side of the story with Trilla, and even though it sort of seems like he's mad at her about this, maybe, each of them is focused on their own struggles, and Cere is using hers to comfort Cal, to tell him that he can't change the past, but he can still change the future. It's a great scene. For a while now, Cal's trauma has been on the back burner, while the relationship between Cere and Trilla's trauma was front and center. And since Cal was accepting Trilla's garbage explanations, it was infuriating. But now it's about Cal's trauma, and Cere is giving her own explanations from her own experience and using it to support him. She takes him to the Jedi Temple on Ilum to reforge his lightsaber, which forces Cal to continue to face his past. Now it feels like all these trauma stories are finally working together. Cal and Cere are beginning to use theirs as support for each other. Malicos and Trilla's stories act as foils for Cal's, and Merrin's story, which mirrors Cal's, is starting to get introduced. The only thing that feels a little off here is Cere's explanation of how she used the dark side. It's something Trilla said earlier too, but it didn't really get any focus until now. I don't like this, because it makes it feel like the dark side is stronger. Yoda explicitly tells us it is not. Quicker, easier, more seductive, but not more powerful. My understanding of the Force is that it's a tool, and how you use it is what matters, not what powers you use. Luke wasn't using the dark side when he choked out these Gamorreans. A Jedi uses the Force for defense, not for aggression. Killing your torturers and breaking out of prison seems like self-defense to me. I don't know, Cal just murdered countless Night Brothers in a home invasion, and this is what counts as dark side? Malicos is for sure deep in the dark side because he's using the Force to dominate the Night Brothers. I get that Cere was mad, but no one blames Luke for being mad when he fought Vader because in the end he acted with mercy. Same with Kyle and Tavion. I think there's probably a way to explain Cere's experience that makes it more about how seductive she found acting in her anger to be, and was worried it would lead her down the dark path, instead of this, like, I used the dark side, but not for anything bad, lol. What exactly the light and dark sides of the Force are can be a bit of a touchy subject. I do understand that her state of mind is important. The Jedi are partly influenced by Buddhism, and so right thought is at least somewhat relevant here, but that's a rabbit hole we don't have time for. I think one thing that would have helped a lot was not to have her say she used the dark side, but to use a euphemism like tapped into my anger, because it makes it clear we are talking about stuff related to the dark side without defining what the dark side is, and respects the Star Wars tradition of being flexible with the morality.
But how am I to know the good side from the bad?
You will know when you are calm, at peace, passive.
It isn't absolute. It's something that you experience. This also makes it about her experience of doing something bad, which can be personally true for her instead of making it some absolute wrong she committed. And while we're talking about the Force, I do want to mention another way the dark side seems weird. The game acts like you can just get tortured into being a dark Jedi. I don't think it's supposed to work like this. The dark side is about temptation, not like torturing people into compliance. Like when falls to the dark side in KOTOR, it's because they are tortured and tempted. Malak preys upon weaknesses that we as a player know about because we've witnessed them firsthand. Though I suppose it's convenient for writers not to have to invent plausible character weaknesses if they can just be mind-controlled into being bad guys. Trilla already has an excuse they could use. Maybe when Cere betrayed her, she started to buy into a galaxy where weakness is something to be exploited. After all, that's what happened to her and her master. If we focused on this part of her character and made her more tragic, Cal wouldn't need to believe her stupid lies, and Cere could still plausibly feel like she failed her apprentice. Cere and Trilla's relationship is so frustrating because it feels like all the pieces for truly compelling drama are there, but they just didn't use them. Anyway, once we get to Ilum, we spend a while without a lightsaber, which just makes us appreciate having one even more. The time is used for exploration, puzzles, and most importantly, Cal going through the ruins of a place that was a huge part of his early Jedi identity, and we get lots of good character and flavor about Cal and his past that's totally missing in the Zepho sections. Finally, we reach the innermost cave, where his new lightsaber crystal is calling him. And then some weird stuff happens. He loses his droid buddy for a minute, a vision of his kid self pulls him out of the ice, and then the crystal breaks when he grabs it, and he thinks he's failed. His droid comes and finds him, and then shows him that, because they are such good friends now, right at this moment, he's gotten his memories back, which were only supposed to come back when he trusted someone else as much as he did old Eno Cordova. He shows him the moment his memory was encrypted, which gives Cal the motivation to remake his lightsaber even though the crystal was broken, because apparently that didn't actually matter. Or if it did matter, he overcame it somehow with the power of perseverance and friendship. None of this makes any sense, but it doesn't matter, because the story beats still work. This is why the hero's journey is used so much. This is the innermost cave. Cal is weaponless. He's just relived the worst moment of his life, and it hurt so much he destroyed his lightsaber. He's walked through the place where his younger, undamaged self was formed, which just reminds him of what he sees as his failures. He reaches for what he sees as his redemption, and it cracks, and only the power of friendship and determination allow him to push past feeling like a failure and reforge his lightsaber and himself. From now on, Cal will be confident and self-assured. He will be able to face his failures and move forward, not just the ones of the past, but the ones to come. And this is why the nonsensical details of what happened here just don't matter, because the story is working structurally and thematically. And it keeps working. Cal is able to face the vision of his master again and emerge victorious through peace, mercy, and persistence, the traits of a Jedi. He talks to Merrin and speaks from the heart about his pain, which lets her see how much they have in common. She can feel the difference between him and Malicos, so she chooses to ally with him. Cal is able to push back against what Malicos says in a way that he wasn't able to before. Malicos criticizes the Jedi in a way that rings true, and Cal is able to acknowledge that while maintaining that Malicos is wrong.
Jedi fell long before the Purge. We were stifled by tradition, deafened by our past glories, blinded by endless war.
Maybe, but it's never over, Malicos. We stand here now, the chance to learn, to rebuild from our mistakes.
Note that now they do not use the words dark Jedi or dark side. Cal is able to argue against what Malicos is actually saying without resorting to those labels, which makes his arguments much more powerful. With Merrin's help, he defeats Malicos, and after he gets the MacGuffin, Merrin tells him she's decided to leave Dathomir with him. She and Cal have by far the best character dynamic in the game. Their banter is great, and it all feels real and earned in exactly the way Cal and Cere's relationship at the beginning did not. Finally, it's time to unlock the secrets of the vault. Cal touches this wall and gets a vision of himself after he trains the younglings of the Holocron. They get hunted by the Empire, and he becomes an Inquisitor. After receiving this vision, the Holocron appears. Maybe it works sort of like the Mirror of Desire in Harry Potter, and can only be found by someone who wants to use it for good. But fortunately for Trilla, he's handily found it for her, because she's been following him the whole time. Unfortunately for her, this is the new and improved Cal, and so he knocks the crap out of her before grabbing her lightsaber. But the raw anguish of her past, imbued in this object, triggers his sense exposition power, which she somehow knows about, and gives her time to grab the holocron and get out. But this is what I mean when I say Cal was reforged. When he gets back to the ship, the first thing he does is apologize to Cere, which is very welcome, though, like I said before, I wish it was a deeper and more specific apology. Then he tells them Trilla took the holocron, not as a way to beat himself up for a failure, but as a problem to be solved. He immediately positions the problem as him not knowing where she took it, and doesn't dwell on the fact that she took it. Again, Cere tries to say that it was all her fault, and still Cal doesn't say it wasn't, but at least he gets her focused on the future. Cere knows where Trilla has taken it, and she prepares herself to return to the place where it all began, the Inquisitor's fortress. Seeing how strong he's become, Cere finds the strength to reconnect with the Force, and takes it upon herself to knight him as a Jedi and complete his character arc.
Kneel.
This final mission is an incredible climax where everything is working together beautifully. Cere and Cal's character arcs are coming together. His defeat of Malicos and his alliance and friendship with Merrin have shown Cal's strength and compassion as a Jedi. Through his example and his faith in her as his mentor, Cere has found the strength to be a Jedi once more. And the combat is awesome again. It really began ramping back up on Dathomir, but it continued with Ilum, and in particular with the Malicos fight. It started to feel like you needed those Force power stims. It felt like the game was balanced around the assumption that you did have it. Here on the final level, the base of the Inquisitors, the game isn't afraid to throw waves of challenging enemies at you and assume that you have the skill and Force points to deal with it. It feels awesome, and as Cal begins to truly feel like a Jedi in this story, you also feel like a Jedi in the combat. The final fight with Trilla is incredibly well designed. The torture chair looms in the background as a reminder of their trauma, and she steps up the sound effects, the banter, the animations, and the mechanics. Cere and Trilla get to have a pretty good scene that's still undercut by Cere blaming herself for breaking under torture, and Trilla gets one brief moment of redemption before the head Inquisitor himself, Vader, shows up to stop the fun. For me, this was a fun surprise. It makes sense that he was the one training and converting them, and it's the payoff for the Dark Shadow comment Cere made earlier. And making him a horror game antagonist as you are forced to run away works well at showing how scary and strong Vader is. Cere pops back up and does some cool Jedi stuff to help Cal at a crucial moment, and then we get some more dark side stuff that annoyed me less because Cere was still able to use the light side of the Force very strongly to stop Vader's lightsaber. They manage to escape with the help of Merrin, and Cal wakes up on the ship. Merrin gets a well-earned awkward hug, and the gang has a great moment of bonding in their victory. Cal decides to destroy the holocron in keeping with the vision he got in the vault, and I like this ending. Now, earlier he said to Merrin that they'll be hunted down if he doesn't find them first, and arguably if we're trusting the will of the Force, Cal got the holocron to use it, so isn't that maybe the will of the Force? But this is a character-driven story, and this is the right decision for his character. It shows how much he's grown and how confident he's become with himself, but it also acknowledges how much he's gone through since Order 66. In keeping with the themes of the game, he chooses not to inflict more children with that same trauma, and instead let them find their own path in this dangerous galaxy, just like he did. I think this is the right choice for Cal and company. Cere wanted to remake the Jedi Order to fight the Empire, but in the Vault, Cal saw that wasn't going to work. If the entire Jedi Order couldn't stop them, a small band of rogue Jedi isn't going to be able to either, and it's not worth the damage to those kids' lives. This feels like a good Jedi ending for a good Jedi story. We get a great final shot as Cal says "where to now" that sets up the inevitable sequel. Still, I think it would be smart to abandon these characters. They've all completed their arcs, and I think it would be really hard to write a second installment with him as the main character after how much he's grown here, but maybe they could make it work. I think playing as Cal's apprentice is probably the move, a la Jedi Academy, but we'll see. As much as the middle portion of this game sort of sucked, the writer had laid some good groundwork that allowed them to bring the story to a spectacular conclusion. It's unfortunate because I personally know people who abandoned the game in that section just before it got great, and I'm sure there are many more out there, but at least it finished strong. It's also interesting how a story that felt mediocre for most of the game still managed that, and it shows how critical underlying themes and story structure are to a well-told story. Even when it starts to stray from those things a bit, if it can bring it home, the story can still land if the foundation is there. It's also a good example of how gameplay and story in games are sort of independent, each one sucked in the middle section for totally different reasons, but they work together towards a whole sucky experience. Compare, for example, the Tavion and Second Sister fights. Both of these fights are quite challenging. Both happen around the same point in the game and the story. They are followed up by a big reveal and a change in character relationships and priorities, but Tavion's fight culminates in the feeling that you beat her and the game acknowledging that, but the rush of the victory is undercut by her groveling and confessions, and so we hope that Cal spares her. Then he does. It's an amazing moment in the story. After beating Trilla, the game makes you lose in a cutscene, and then Cal treats her revelations like a child. It does help that the fight is quite hard, and you only have to get her to half health, so it can feel like a relief to get out of it, but it still couples losing in a cutscene with acting like a loser in the cutscene. Even though both fights were good, the story aftermath of Fallen Order manages to make it feel bad, whereas Outcast takes the accomplishment of winning the fight and makes it even more satisfying afterwards. I have played a lot of Star Wars games. I basically grew up on every LucasArts game I could get my hands on. KOTOR is the most in-depth Star Wars video game story I have ever played, but Fallen Order is definitely second. KOTOR was a better story overall, no question, but it's also more complex and dabbles in a lot of different stories in classic RPG style. Fallen Order is very focused on that question I brought up earlier. What would it be like to be a Jedi? For Fallen Order, that question is best answered when it says that being a Jedi is about faith in yourself, faith in the Force, and overcoming trauma and failure. Cal is at his most powerful when he is selfless and trusting, and it allows him to win friends and fight back against temptation and poisonous ideas. This is the same philosophy that Luke uses in Jedi Outcast. When Kyle shows up to get his lightsaber, Luke asks him to give up his anger before it leads him to the dark side, but Kyle refuses. Still, Luke doesn't try to stop him or kick him out or anything, because to Luke the light and dark sides of the Force are a path that you walk. Anger leads to the dark side, but it isn't the dark side by itself. It's a pattern you learn, a temptation you succumb to over time. Luke knows that he needs to let Kyle walk his own path and be there for him when and how he can, not to judge him or berate him or stop him from acting, because that would only feed his anger. In the end, Outcast and Fallen Order both agree on what makes a Jedi. Some of Fallen Order even agrees on how people fall to the dark side, understandably, and a little at a time. Malicos has real and justified grievances against the Jedi Order, and he nursed those resentments all the way down the path to the dark. But the game is smart enough not to label him or his actions, but merely to show them to us. Kyle's anger was more than justified, but even if they had killed Jan, that wouldn't make it right, but still understandable. That's how you tell a good story, by making your characters understandably human. It really feels like there was one half of Fallen Order which someone who really understood the Jedi and the Force wrote, and that's all the business with Cal, Malicos, and Merrin, and another half with Seer and Trilla that's just totally nonsensical. But it's not new nonsensical. Plenty of modern Star Wars media treats the dark side of the Force as magical brainwashing nonsense, or acts like being mad one time turns you to the dark side, or portrays the dark side not as a long road of easy decisions, but just angst. In modern Star Wars, the lines are clear. Get mad, you bad. And the relative nuance of Kyle, Cal, and Malicos is something I miss, and I loved to see it in this game. I want to see more of this, but I doubt I will. The interpretations of the Force I find obnoxious seem to be everywhere now, and even though I'm happy the game was able to get away from it even a little, I doubt that will continue to be the case. But we can always hope. Sadly, it seems like the references that annoy me so much are just going to be here forever.
Seer, why didn't you tell me?
These two also show how much games have changed. Fallen Order is full of gorgeous set pieces and has a deeply involved story with combat based around satisfying and complicated animations, inputs, and abilities. The mechanics of Jedi Outcast, while excellent, are extremely simple in comparison in a post-Dark Souls world. Jedi Outcast has a bunch of mechanics and then they let you and the game go wild with them, whereas Fallen Order uses this more modern style of parrying, timing, and specific counters that are streamlined and designed. It's a tighter and more refined experience, if you ignore that totally unbalanced bit in the middle, but less organic. In the end, it comes down to which you prefer, but personally I love how Outcast is a mechanical exploration of what it means to fight like a Jedi, while telling a Jedi story faithful to the Star Wars I know and love. I liked Fallen Order the best when it was doing that too, but there's not as much of it. On the other hand, the same way Outcast adapted Doom to Star Wars, Fallen Order adapted Dark Souls to Star Wars, even though it's a lot easier. Which, if you're going to have difficulty settings, I feel like you should make the hardest difficulty at least as hard as the genre you are copying. I didn't rage quit from an encounter even once, come on. Also, your mileage may vary, but the game can be buggy. I personally hardly encountered any problems, but I know people who had game-breaking bugs. So if you are interested in playing it, do be warned that the optimization isn't the best. In the end, even though I believe Outcast is the tighter overall experience, which is what Doom and Dark Souls have in common with it, I am mostly just happy that people are still trying to ask what it means to be, or play as, a Jedi. Thanks for watching. This one has been in the works for quite a while, ever since I first played Fallen Order about a year ago, but I ran into some technical problems with the footage, so it got put off until I was ready to replay the game. If you'd like to see more game or game story analysis like this, let me know. I like games and I like game stories, so it's always something I've wanted to do on the channel. See you next time.